I was hanging my grandmother's evergreen wreath on my front door when Brenda Carmichael marched up my driveway like she owned the place, clutching her purple clipboard like it was a legal warrant. "That's not approved," she announced, her voice sharp enough to cut through the December morning air. Section 12. Subsection 4 of the HOA guidelines clearly states that all holiday decorations must be from the pre-approved list. Natural evergreens are prohibited due to fire hazards and pest concerns. I turned to face her, my hand still holding the wreath against the door. "Brenda, this is a family heirloom. My grandmother made this wreath in 1952. It's just greenery from the trees on this property." "I don't care if Martha Stewart herself braided it," Brenda snapped, her perfectly highlighted hair not moving an inch in the cold breeze. "Rules are rules, Peter. You've been living in Meadowbrook Estates for 2 years now. You should know better." "I'm Peter Vaughn, a 34-year-old history teacher at Riverside High School in Savannah, Georgia. I'd bought this beautiful old house on the outskirts of what was now called Meadowbrook Estates, a neighborhood that had been developed around several historic properties. My house was one of the originals, built in 1847, and I'd fallen in love with it the moment I saw the original heart pine floors and the hand-carved moldings. "The wreath stays," I said firmly, securing it to the brass hook. Brenda's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. "You'll receive a formal violation notice within 24 hours. That's a $200 fine for the first offense. If it's not removed within 5 days, the fine doubles every week until compliance." She spun on her designer heels and stalked back to her golf cart, leaving me standing there with my jaw clenched. I'd dealt with Brenda's nonsense before. She'd complained about my mailbox being the wrong shade of black, about my lawn being a 1/4 inch too tall, and about my failure to attend the mandatory monthly HOA meetings, because I had evening classes at the community college where I taught adult education courses twice a week. I went inside, the old door creaking on its original hinges, and made myself a cup of coffee. The house wrapped around me like a warm blanket, all original woodwork and history. When I'd bought the place, the previous owner, an elderly woman named Margaret Sutton, had told me stories about the house. It had been built by a shipping merchant named Josiah Crawford, who'd made his fortune in the cotton trade. The house had survived the Civil War, countless hurricanes, and over a century and a half of Georgia weather. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my friend Derek, who also lived in the neighborhood. "Saw Brenda leaving your place. What now?" I called him instead of texting back. "She's on a rampage about my grandmother's wreath. Says it's not pre-approved." Derek laughed, but there was sympathy in it. "Man, she's been worse than usual lately. Did you hear she tried to fine the Hendersons because their kid drew a hopscotch grid on their driveway with washable chalk?" "You're kidding." "Nope. Said it was graffiti. They had to threaten legal action before she backed off." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table, which was actually a restored farmhouse table I'd found at an estate sale, and stared at the wreath through the window. It was beautiful. A simple circle of cedar and pine branches woven together with red berries from the holly bush that grew beside the house. My grandmother had taught my mother how to make them, and my mother had taught me before she passed away 3 years ago. This wreath was one of the last things my grandmother had made before dementia took her memories. The violation notice arrived the next morning, tucked into my storm door. It was printed on official-looking letterhead with the Meadowbrook Estates logo, a pretentious little emblem featuring a gazebo that didn't actually exist in the neighborhood. Violation notice. Unauthorized holiday decoration. Fine, $200. Compliance required within 5 business days. I photographed the notice and sent it to my lawyer friend, Tom Richardson, asking if he had any thoughts. Tom and I had gone to college together at the University of Georgia. He practiced real estate law in downtown Savannah. Tom called me 20 minutes later. "Pete, I hate to say it, but if you signed the HOA agreement when you bought the house, they can probably enforce this. Have you read through your covenants?" "Not recently," I admitted. "I mean, I skimmed them when I bought the place, but it was 100 pages of legal jargon. Let me look into it. Send me a copy of everything you signed at closing. There might be something we can work with." I spent that evening in my study, which had once been Josiah Crawford's library, digging through the boxes of paperwork from my home purchase. The HOA covenants and restrictions document was indeed massive, filled with arcane rules about everything from fence heights to approved paint colors. But as I read through the initial pages, something caught my attention. There was a section about properties within the development boundaries. It listed lot numbers and addresses. But there was a footnote that read, "Properties existing prior to development and not subdivided from original parcels may be subject to different restrictions. See County Recorder's Office for historical property designations." I grabbed my laptop and started searching the Chatham County property records. My address was 4782 Old River Road. The current neighborhood had been developed in 2018, but my house and a few others dated back much further. I pulled up the GIS mapping system and traced my property lines. My lot was larger than the surrounding properties, almost 3 acres compared to the half-acre lots that made up the rest of Meadowbrook Estates. The property lines matched the original 1847 survey, which I'd seen in the framed documents the previous owner had left in the attic. I called Tom back. "I think my property might not actually be part of the HOA. "What makes you say that?" I explained what I'd found. Tom was quiet for a moment. "That's interesting. Really interesting. Look, I'm swamped this week, but do you want me to do some digging? This might cost you a few hundred in billable hours, but it could save you from HOA hell forever." "Do it," I said without hesitation. "I'm not taking down my grandmother's wreath." The next day at school, I was teaching my junior class about the antebellum South when the principal's secretary knocked on my door. "Mr. Vaughn, there's someone here from your homeowner association. She says it's urgent." I excused myself and found Brenda standing in the front office, looking completely out of place among the teenage chaos of a high school between periods. She thrust another paper at me. "Since you refuse to acknowledge the first notice, I'm personally delivering the second. The wreath is still hanging and you're now in violation. The fine is now $400, and I've scheduled a hearing with the HOA board for next Tuesday at 7. The office secretary, Mrs. Patterson, raised her eyebrows at me. I took the paper calmly. "Brenda, you drove 30 minutes to the school where I work to deliver this. You're making a mockery of the rules that keep our property values high," she said, loud enough that several students walking past slowed down to watch. "Everyone else in Meadowbrook Estates follows the guidelines." "Why do you think you're special?" "Because my property is special," I said, keeping my voice level. "And I think you know that." Her eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm doing my homework. See you Tuesday." I walked away before she could respond, leaving her sputtering in the front office. Mrs. Patterson gave me a thumbs up as I passed her desk. That weekend, I drove to the Chatham County Recorder's Office in downtown Savannah. The building was a historic structure itself, with marble floors and high ceilings that echoed with footsteps. I requested all documents related to my property address, going back to the original land grant. The clerk, a patient woman named Dorothy who reminded me of my grandmother, helped me navigate the archive system. "Researching your house," she asked, something like that. I'm having an issue with my HOA. She smiled knowingly. Say no more, we get a lot of that. Savannah's full of historic properties that got swallowed up by new developments. Sometimes folks don't realize what they're sitting on. She was right. As I spread out the documents on the research table, a picture emerged that made my heart race. My property had been continuously occupied since 1847. It had been designated as a contributing structure to the Savannah Historic District Extension in 1979, though it sat just outside the main tourist areas. More importantly, there was a conservation easement filed in 1985 by a previous owner, which placed restrictions on what could be done to the property, but also provided certain protections. The easement document specifically mentioned that the property was to be preserved in accordance with the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. It protected the historic character of the house and grounds. I made copies of everything, filling a 2-inch binder with documents. Dorothy helped me find one more crucial piece: the original subdivision plat for Meadowbrook Estates, filed in 2017. The plat map clearly showed my property with a notation: existing structure, not included in subdivision. That's your smoking gun right there, Dorothy said, pointing at the notation. If your property wasn't included in the subdivision, you're not part of the HOA. I thanked her profusely and drove home with my binder of evidence, feeling like I just won the lottery. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. It was Tom. "Pete, you're not going to believe what I found," he said, excitement clear in his voice. "Try me. I just spent 3 hours in the county archives. Your property is listed in the National Register of Historic Places." Well, not individually, but as part of a multiple property submission for antebellum merchant houses in Chatham County. It was added in 1982. I sat in my car, staring at my house with new eyes. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious." I pulled the nomination form. "Your house is specifically mentioned as one of the best preserved examples of Greek Revival architecture with Italianate influences in the county. There are photographs from the 1982 survey in the file." "Tom, the subdivision plat says my property wasn't included in the development." "Then you're not in the HOA," Tom said flatly. "They have no jurisdiction over you. The developer probably knew the property was protected and couldn't force you into the association." "Did you sign any HOA documents at closing?" I thought back, trying to remember. "I don't think so." "I signed a million things, but I don't remember anything specifically about the HOA." "Wait, they started sending me notices about 6 months after I moved in, saying I needed to pay my dues. I ignored the first few because I thought there was some mistake." "Did you ever pay them?" "No." "Good." "Don't. You're not a member. They've been harassing you illegally this whole time." The Tuesday evening HOA meeting approached with the inevitability of a freight train. I spent the intervening days preparing my presentation, printing out maps, photographs, and legal documents. Tom had prepared a formal legal opinion, and I'd even contacted the Georgia Historic Preservation Division to confirm the status of my property. The woman I spoke with there, Amanda Winters, was fascinated by my situation. "This happens more than you'd think," she said. "Historic properties get absorbed into new developments, and the HOAs try to assert control they don't legally have. The National Register listing doesn't prevent you from making changes, but combined with that conservation easement, your property has significant legal protections. And if you're not actually in the subdivision, the HOA has no standing whatsoever." She agreed to send me a formal letter confirming my property's historic status and explaining the implications of the conservation easement. Tuesday evening arrived cold and clear. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a modern building at the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates. I arrived 15 minutes early, my binder under one arm and my laptop bag over my shoulder. The room was set up like a courtroom, with a long table at the front for the board members and rows of chairs facing them. A podium stood in the middle, presumably for residents addressing the board. About 20 people were scattered in the chairs, most of them looking bored or annoyed at having to be there. Brenda sat at the center of the board table, flanked by 4 other members. I recognized 2 of them. Robert Chen, a retired engineer who lived 2 streets over, and Patricia Morrison, a real estate agent who tried to sell me an extended home warranty when I moved in. Brenda called the meeting to order at 7 sharp, running through standard business. Approval of previous minutes, financial reports, updates on landscaping contracts. Finally, she reached the main event. "We have a disciplinary hearing tonight," she announced, looking directly at me. "Peter Vaughn of 4782 Old River Road has repeatedly violated HOA guidelines regarding holiday decorations. Despite multiple notices and escalating fines, the violation continues. Mr. Vaughn, please come forward." I walked to the podium, setting my binder on it. "Thank you for the opportunity to address the board," I began. "I'm here tonight to discuss not just the wreath on my door, but a larger issue that affects the fundamental relationship between my property and this HOA." Brenda held up her hand. "We're here to discuss your violation, nothing else." "Have you removed the unapproved decoration?" "No, and I won't be removing it, because I'm not a member of this HOA and you have no authority over my property." The room went silent. Even the board residents in the back sat up straighter. Brenda's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on burgundy. "That's absurd," she sputtered. "You live in Meadowbrook Estates. Every property owner is part of the HOA. It's mandatory." "Not if your property wasn't included in the subdivision," I said calmly. I opened my binder and pulled out the plat map. This is the official subdivision plat filed with Chatham County in 2017. As you can see, my property is marked as an existing structure not included in the subdivision. I passed copies forward to the board members. Brenda snatched hers and stared at it, her lips moving as she read the notation. "This must be a mistake." "It's not. My property has been continuously occupied since 1847. It was never subdivided from the original land grant. It predates this development by 170 years. Robert Chen spoke up, studying the map with an engineer's eye. "If this is accurate, the subdivision boundaries don't include his lot." "Furthermore," I continued, gaining confidence as I saw confusion and doubt spreading among the board members, "my property is listed in the National Register of Historic Places as part of a multiple property submission for antebellum merchant houses. It was added to the National Register in 1982. I distributed copies of the nomination form and photographs from the historic survey. Patricia Morrison looked genuinely interested, flipping through the pages. "In addition," I said, "there's a conservation easement on my property filed in 1985, which places it under the protection of the Georgia Historic Preservation Division. This easement specifically protects the historic character of the house and grounds." Brenda found her voice again. "Even if all this is true, which I'm not conceding, you still received notices to pay HOA dues when you moved in. Your lack of response doesn't exempt you." "I never signed any HOA documents at closing," I said. "I've reviewed all my closing paperwork. There's no membership agreement, no covenant acceptance, nothing. You started sending me bills 6 months after I moved in, but I'm under no obligation to pay them because I was never a member." I pulled out my final document, the legal opinion Tom had prepared. This is a formal legal opinion from Richardson and Associates, a real estate law firm here in Savannah. It confirms that without inclusion in the subdivision and without signed membership documents, I'm not subject to HOA rules or fees. The other board members were now talking among themselves, ignoring Brenda's attempts to restore order. I pressed my advantage. "I'm not here to cause problems," I said, addressing the room at large. "I'm a history teacher. I love my house and I respect its history. But I won't be bullied into following rules that don't apply to me. The wreath on my door is a family tradition, made from greenery grown on property that's been standing since before the Civil War. It's not a fire hazard. It's not a pest problem. It's not any of the HOA's business." An older man in the back raised his hand. "I have a question. Why did the HOA start sending him notices if his property isn't part of the association?" Good question. I looked at Brenda, whose face had gone from red to pale. "I'd like to know that too." Brenda shuffled her papers. "There must have been an administrative error. When the development was built, all addresses on Old River Road were added to the database. An administrative error that's resulted in 2 years of harassment," I said. "Fines for my mailbox, my lawn height, my meeting attendance, and now my grandmother's wreath. When does an error become a pattern of behavior?" Patricia Morrison set down the historic nomination form. "Brenda, did you know his property was historic when you started issuing violations?" "I don't see what that has to do with anything," Brenda snapped. "Rules are rules." "But they're not his rules to follow," Robert Chen said quietly. He looked at me. "Mr. Vaughn, I apologize. This should have been caught much earlier. If your property isn't in the subdivision, we have no standing to enforce any rules or collect any fees." "I want to see proof from the developer," Brenda insisted. "This could all be fabricated." I'd anticipated this. I contacted Milestone Development, the company that built Meadowbrook Estates. I spoke with their general counsel yesterday. They confirmed that my property and 2 others on Old River Road were existing structures that couldn't be included in the development due to their historic status and the size of the original lots. They're sending a formal letter to the HOA board confirming this. That was a bit of a stretch. I'd left a message with Milestone Development and hadn't heard back, but I was confident they'd confirm what the public records already showed. Another board member, a younger man I didn't recognize, raised his hand. "Even if Mr. Vaughn's property is somehow special, shouldn't we be consistent in enforcing our rules for everyone else?" "My situation is unique because of history and law," I said. "But maybe this is an opportunity for the board to reconsider some of the more arbitrary rules. Do natural wreaths really decrease property values? Do mailboxes need to be exact Pantone color matches? Does a kid's chalk drawing hurt anyone?" I saw heads nodding in the audience. The meeting was slipping away from Brenda's control. She stood abruptly. "This hearing is tabled pending verification of Mr. Vaughn's claims. The board will consult with our attorney and reconvene." "That's fine," I said. "But I want it clear that all fines issued to me are void, and I expect no further harassment about any aspect of my property. If the HOA continues to assert jurisdiction it doesn't have, I'll pursue legal action for harassment and seek damages." Tom had coached me on that line. It was important to establish clear boundaries. Robert Chen nodded. "That seems fair. Mr. Vaughn, thank you for bringing this to our attention properly. I think we owe you an apology." "Several apologies," Patricia Morrison added, giving Brenda a pointed look. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that, with residents crowding around me to ask about my house and see the historic documents. Several people mentioned their own frustrations with HOA rules. One woman told me Brenda had tried to fine her for having a vegetable garden in her backyard because it wasn't aesthetically consistent with neighborhood standards. I drove home that night feeling vindicated but exhausted. The wreath still hung on my door, illuminated by the porch light, looking exactly as it should. The next few days were quiet. I heard through Derek that the HOA board was in crisis mode, with several members calling for Brenda's removal as president. Apparently, I wasn't the only one she'd been overzealously targeting, and my very public revelation had opened the floodgates of complaints. Tom called me Thursday afternoon. Milestone Developments Council got back to me. You were right. Your property and 2 others were specifically excluded from the HOA because of their historic status and existing lot configurations. He's sending a formal letter to the board and copying you. He also said they'd told Brenda this when the development was first completed, but she apparently ignored it. She knew, I said, anger rising. She's been harassing me for 2 years knowing she had no authority. That might constitute tortious interference or harassment. You could potentially sue, I thought about it. I don't want to sue, I just want to be left alone. Fair enough, but keep documentation of everything just in case. The following Tuesday, I received a certified letter from the HOA board. It was signed by Robert Chen, who'd apparently taken over as acting president. The letter formally acknowledged that my property was not part of Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, apologized for the administrative confusion, and confirmed that all fines were void. It requested that I disregard any future correspondence sent in error. There was no mention of Brenda or any consequences for her actions. That bothered me, but I decided to let it go. I had my victory. The next weekend, I was in my front yard raking leaves when a car pulled up. A woman in her 60s got out, looking at my house with obvious appreciation. "Excuse me," she called. "Is this the Crawford house?" "It was built by Josiah Crawford in 1847, I confirmed, walking over. "I'm the current owner, Peter Vaughn." "I'm Rebecca Norton, with the Coastal Georgia Historical Society. I heard about your situation with the HOA through a colleague at the Preservation Division. We're putting together a tour of historic homes for next spring. Would you be interested in participating?" I'd never considered opening my house for tours, but the idea appealed to me. "What would that involve?" "We do a weekend in April, just before the heat gets too bad. Homeowners volunteer to open their houses for a few hours each day. We provide trained docents to manage the crowds and share the history. It's a fundraiser for preservation projects and education programs." I thought about my grandmother, about how she'd loved history and beautiful old things. About my mother, who'd shared those loves with me. About the wreath on my door that had started this whole journey. "I'd love to," I said. "This house deserves to be appreciated." Rebecca smiled warmly. "Wonderful. I'll send you the information packet, and Mr. Vaughn, thank you for standing up to that HOA. Historic properties need advocates." After she left, I continued raking, thinking about the journey from that first confrontation with Brenda to this moment. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Derek. "Did you hear? Brenda resigned. Board voted to censure her and she quit." I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief, certainly. Satisfaction. But also a twinge of something that might have been pity. Brenda had been so certain of her authority, so invested in her rules and regulations, that she'd lost sight of reason and basic human decency. I texted back, "Wow, who's the new president?" "Robert Chen. He's already talking about revising the rules to be less insane. Your rebellion might have saved the whole neighborhood." That was overstating it, but I appreciated the sentiment. I finished raking and went inside, where the afternoon sun was streaming through the original wavy glass windows, making patterns on the heart pine floors. I made coffee in my kitchen, which still had the original brick hearth where servants had once cooked meals for the Crawford family. My house had survived war, economic collapse, hurricanes, and time. It had sheltered generations of families, witnessed births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows. And now it had survived Brenda Carmichael and the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. The wreath hung on my door through Christmas and into January, as was my family's tradition. No one complained. No violation notices appeared. Derek told me that Robert Chen had pushed through new rules that exempted traditional natural decorations from the pre-approval process, citing my case as evidence that the old rules were too restrictive. In February, I received an invitation to the monthly HOA meeting. It was friendly rather than demanding, asking if I'd be willing to give a short presentation about my house's history for interested residents. I agreed, and the meeting turned into an informal lecture that dozens of neighbors attended. People were genuinely fascinated by the house's history. I showed photographs from the 1982 Historic Survey, documents from the Civil War era, and even some artifacts I'd found in the attic when I moved in. A few residents asked about their own homes, wondering if they might have hidden history too. Patricia Morrison approached me after the presentation. "I handle historic property sales sometimes. If you ever decide to sell, I'd love to represent you, though I hope you stay forever. This neighborhood needs someone who appreciates real history, not just the fake prestige an HOA tries to create." "I'm not planning to sell," I assured her. "This house and I have been through too much together now." Spring came, bringing the azaleas and dogwoods into bloom. The tour weekend arrived in mid-April, perfect weather with clear skies and a gentle breeze. I'd spent weeks preparing, cleaning and organizing, working with the Historical Society's documentation team to create accurate information about the house's features and history. The docents arrived early Saturday morning to set up. They were a mix of retired teachers, history enthusiasts, and preservation professionals. One of them, a woman named Sarah, had actually done research on Josiah Crawford for her master's thesis. "He was fascinating," she told me as we did a final walkthrough. "Self-made man, started with nothing and built a shipping empire. He was also surprisingly progressive for his time. There are records of him advocating for better treatment of workers and donating to schools." "I didn't know that," I said. "I've mostly focused on the architectural history." "The house reflects his values," Sarah said. "Quality construction, attention to detail, built to last. He wanted to create something permanent, something that would outlive him. And here we are, 178 years later, standing in his home." The tours began at 10. I'd expected maybe a dozen people throughout the day. By noon, we'd had over 100 visitors. They came in groups of 10, spending about 30 minutes exploring the rooms while docents explained the architectural features, the history, and the preservation efforts. I stationed myself in the backyard, where I'd set up a display about the conservation easement and the property's National Register listing. People asked thoughtful questions about historic preservation, about my battle with the HOA, and about what it was like living in such an old house. A reporter from the Savannah Morning News showed up in the afternoon. She'd heard about the story through the Historical Society and wanted to do a feature article. I gave her an interview in the parlor, explaining the whole saga from the wreath to the research to the final resolution. "It's really a story about respecting history," I told her. "Not just architectural history, but family history, community history. My grandmother's wreath represented generations of tradition. The HOA saw it as a violation of arbitrary rules, but some things are more important than rules." The article ran the following Sunday with the headline, "History Teacher Saves Historic Home from HOA Overreach." It was a well-written piece that explained the broader issues of historic preservation in rapidly developing areas. I got calls and emails from people all over Georgia who'd faced similar situations with their HOAs. One call stood out. It was from a lawyer in Atlanta named Susan Martinez, who specialized in HOA law and historic preservation issues. "Mr. Vaughn, I've been following your case with interest. Would you be willing to let me use your story in a presentation I'm giving at a property law conference? I think it's an excellent example of how historic designations and conservation easements can protect homeowners from overreaching associations." "Of course," I said. "If it helps other people, absolutely. I'd also like to discuss the potential for a broader lawsuit against the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. What they did, knowingly harassing you for 2 years despite being informed your property wasn't in their jurisdiction, might constitute a pattern of bad faith that deserves legal consequences." I hesitated. I'd moved past my anger at Brenda. The HOA had new leadership. Things were improving. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't think so. Brenda's gone. The board apologized. I just want to move forward." "I understand," Susan said. "But think about it. Sometimes legal action isn't about revenge. It's about creating precedent that protects the next person. If HOAs know they can harass historic property owners without consequences, they'll keep doing it." She had a point. I promised to consider it and call her back. After we hung up, I sat in my study, surrounded by the books and documents that had helped me win my small battle. The wreath was long gone, replaced by a spring garland my grandmother had also made, this one featuring silk flowers and grapevine. I thought about all the people who'd contacted me with their own HOA horror stories. The families fined for having the wrong color roses, for parking in their own driveways, for children's toys being visible from the street. The retirees forced to spend thousands on unnecessary improvements to maintain arbitrary neighborhood aesthetics. Maybe Susan was right. Maybe this needed to be bigger than just my wreath and my house. I called Tom. "Remember when you asked if I wanted to sue the HOA, what would that actually look like?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "Are you serious? I thought you wanted to let it go." "I did. But I keep thinking about everyone else dealing with this kind of thing. What if we could set a precedent? It would be expensive, time-consuming, and there's no guarantee of winning. But Peter, if you're asking my professional opinion, you have a strong case. Brenda knew your property wasn't in the HOA. The developer told her. She continued issuing violations and fines anyway. That's bad faith, potentially fraud. And if she collected any money from you under false pretenses, that might even be criminal." "I never paid the fines," I said. "I ignored them because I thought they were ridiculous, not because I knew they were illegal. But she tried to collect money she knew she had no right to demand. She threatened me with legal action she knew was baseless. Harassment, extortion, fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress. We could make several arguments. And Pete, here's the thing. If we sue and win, the HOA's insurance might cover damages. That money could fund rule changes, legal protections for other residents, maybe even help other historic property owners fighting similar battles." I made my decision. "Let's do it. But I want this to be about more than just me. Can we structure it somehow to help the whole community?" "We can try. Let me make some calls." The next few months were a whirlwind of legal activity. Tom and Susan Martinez teamed up, bringing in another partner who specialized in class action lawsuits. They sent a formal demand letter to the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, outlining the case and demanding not just voiding of my fines, but compensation for harassment, a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and significant changes to HOA governance. The current board, led by Robert Chen, was actually cooperative. They'd been horrified to learn the extent of Brenda's actions. Robert personally called me to apologize again and to say the board would support whatever resolution I felt was fair. "We want to make this right," he said. "Brenda was out of control, and we should have caught it sooner. Several of us are new to the board, elected after the situation with you came to light. We're trying to reform things, but we welcome outside pressure to do it right." The problem was Brenda herself. She'd hired her own lawyer and was fighting everything, claiming she'd simply been doing her job and that any mistakes were honest errors. Her lawyer argued that she'd relied on information provided by the HOA's management company and couldn't be held personally liable. It was technically plausible, except for one thing. Tom and Susan had obtained emails through discovery that showed the development company had explicitly told Brenda, in writing, that my property and two others were not part of the HOA. She'd received this information in December of my first year in the house, months before she started issuing violations to me. Her response email was devastating. "Understood, but we should treat all properties on Old River Road consistently to avoid confusion. I'll handle any issues that arise." "That's consciousness of guilt," Susan explained when she showed me the email. "She knew she had no authority and she exercised it anyway. That's not an honest mistake. That's intentional misconduct." The case dragged through summer and into fall. I continued teaching, giving tours of my house and living my life, but the legal battle was always there in the background. Discovery revealed other troubling patterns in Brenda's tenure as HOA president. She'd targeted several other families with aggressive enforcement of minor violations while ignoring identical issues when they involved her friends. One family, the Johnsons, had been fined repeatedly for their children's play equipment being visible from the street. Meanwhile, Brenda's next-door neighbor had an identical swing set in the same location on their lot, but had never received a single violation notice. The Hendersons, who Derek had mentioned months ago, had documentation of Brenda's attempt to fine them for their child's chalk drawings. She'd actually called code enforcement on them, reporting them for vandalism. A picture emerged of someone who'd used her position not to maintain neighborhood standards, but to exercise petty authority and settle personal grudges. The case expanded from just my situation to a broader examination of HOA abuse. In October, Brenda's lawyer approached Tom and Susan with a settlement offer. Brenda would resign permanently from any HOA position, pay a substantial fine to be used for neighborhood improvements, and the HOA's insurance would cover damages to be distributed among affected residents. In exchange, we'd agree not to pursue criminal charges for fraud or extortion. I met with Tom and Susan in Tom's downtown Savannah office to discuss it. The numbers were significant, enough to fund a complete revision of the HOA's governing documents and establish an oversight committee to prevent future abuse. "What about criminal charges?" I asked. "Could we actually pursue those?" Susan nodded. "We've consulted with the district attorney's office. They're interested." Brenda knowingly attempted to collect money under false pretenses, made fraudulent threats of legal action, and potentially filed false reports with government agencies. "That's enough for several charges." "But," I could hear the hesitation in her voice, "but a criminal trial would be long, expensive, and uncertain. Juries don't always take HOA cases seriously. They see it as petty neighborhood squabbles. We might win, but Brenda might walk." "This settlement guarantees real, concrete changes." I thought about my grandmother's wreath, about the principal that had started this whole journey, about the other families Brenda had harassed. If we settle, does she admit wrongdoing? Yes, Tom said. Part of the settlement is a formal admission that she exceeded her authority, knowingly violated residents' rights, and caused harm through her actions. That admission becomes part of the public record, and she can never hold an HOA position again. Anywhere, not just here. We're making that a condition. I looked out Tom's window at the Savannah skyline, thinking about justice and revenge and the difference between them. I want one more thing, an apology, a real one in writing to every family she targeted, not a legal non-apology. An actual acknowledgement of harm and expression of regret. Susan smiled. I'll make it happen. The settlement was finalized in November, almost exactly a year after Brenda had first confronted me about my wreath. The HOA held a special meeting to announce the terms and vote on the revised governing documents. I attended, sitting in the back and watching as Robert Chen explained everything. The new rules included a streamlined violation process with multiple levels of review before fines could be issued, an appeals system with neutral arbitrators, and explicit protections for historic properties. The settlement money funded not just the legal changes, but also neighborhood improvements like better playground equipment and repair of the community pool. After the formal business, Robert asked me to come forward. I did, curious about what he had planned. Mr. Vaughn, on behalf of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board and all the residents, I want to thank you. Your courage in standing up for your rights led to changes that benefit everyone. We're a better community because you refused to accept unjust treatment. People applauded. It felt surreal. What had started as a simple act of hanging my grandmother's wreath had become a catalyst for genuine change. A woman in the front row raised her hand. Mr. Vaughn, I have a question. Why did you push this so hard? Was it really just about the wreath? At first, yes, I said honestly. The wreath was important to me because of what it represented. Family, tradition, connection to the past. But as I learned more about my house's history, I realized preservation isn't just about old buildings. It's about protecting what matters from people who want to impose uniformity and control. I paused, gathering my thoughts. I'm a teacher. I believe in rules and structure, but I also believe rules should serve people, not control them. When an HOA becomes more concerned with enforcing arbitrary regulations than with building community, something's gone wrong. I hope what happened here helps other neighborhoods find that balance. There was more applause, and then people began coming up to talk with me. Several mentioned specific changes in the new rules that addressed their concerns. The Johnsons thanked me for including language protecting children's outdoor play equipment. An elderly man named Frank said the new appeals process had already helped him contest a violation he considered unfair. As I was leaving, Patricia Morrison caught up with me. Peter, I don't know if you've been following the local real estate news, but property values in Meadowbrook Estates have actually increased since all this happened. I stopped. Really? I thought the publicity might hurt, just the opposite. The articles about your historic house, the tour weekend, the HOA reforms, it's all made the neighborhood more attractive. People want to live somewhere with character and fair governance. You didn't just save your house from HOA overreach, you made the whole community better. I drove home that evening thinking about unintended consequences and the ripples one small act of resistance could create. My grandmother had made a wreath 70 years ago, never imagining it would one day be at the center of a legal battle that reformed an entire neighborhood's governance. December arrived, and with it, the anniversary of that first confrontation. I took the wreath from its careful storage, the same one that had started everything. The evergreen branches had dried, becoming more brittle, but it was still beautiful. I hung it on my door with the original brass hook, taking a moment to photograph it and text the picture to Derek. He replied immediately. Legend status achieved. That weekend, I noticed several other houses in the neighborhood had similar wreaths. Natural greenery, traditional designs, family pieces passed down through generations. The new rules made them permissible, but seeing them felt like more than just legal compliance. It felt like people reclaiming personal expression and family tradition. Christmas that year was quiet but meaningful. I hosted a small dinner for friends, including Tom and Derek and a few neighbors who'd become close through the whole ordeal. We ate at my restored farmhouse table in the dining room where Josiah Crawford had once entertained sea captains and merchants. After dinner, Tom raised a glass to Peter Vaughn, who proved that sometimes fighting City Hall, or at least fighting the HOA, actually works. To historic preservation, Derek added, and to knowing your rights. To grandmothers who make wreaths, I said, and to houses that have stories to tell. We drank, and then someone asked me to give a tour of the house. I led them through the rooms, pointing out original features and sharing stories from the property's history. It was informal and fun, nothing like the formal historical society tours, but it felt right. This house wasn't just a museum piece. It was a home, lived in and loved, connected to the past but part of the present. The new year brought new developments. The Georgia Historic Preservation Division contacted me about conducting a more detailed survey of my property. They were updating their documentation of antebellum structures and wanted to create a comprehensive record of my house's architectural features. The survey took weeks, with specialists photographing every room, documenting construction techniques, and even taking paint samples to determine original color schemes. They found things I'd missed, like penciled notations on the attic rafters from the original builders and a hidden compartment in one of the bedroom walls. This house is a treasure, the lead surveyor told me. The level of preservation is remarkable. Most structures from this period have been significantly altered. You have original windows, original floors, even some original plaster. With your permission, we'd like to nominate this property for individual National Register listing. It's already on the register as part of a multiple property submission, I said. Yes, but individual listing provides additional recognition and potentially more protection. It also makes you eligible for certain preservation grants and tax credits if you ever need to do restoration work. I agreed, and the nomination process began. It would take months, maybe over a year, but the thought of my house receiving that recognition felt like the culmination of everything that had happened. Spring came again, bringing another tour weekend. This time, the crowds were even larger. The publicity from the HOA case had put my house on the map as both a historic property and a symbol of property rights advocacy. The Savannah Morning News ran a follow-up article titled, "From HOA Battle to Preservation Victory: The Crawford House, 1 year later." I was interviewed on a local radio show about historic property rights and HOA reform. A graduate student from Georgia Southern University asked to interview me for her thesis on community governance and historic preservation. The story had taken on a life of its own. But through it all, I remained focused on the simple truth that had started everything. My house was a connection to the past, a reminder that some things have value beyond convenience or conformity. The wreath had been a symbol, but the house itself was the real story. In May, I received a letter from the National Park Service informing me that my property had been officially listed in the National Register of Historic Places as an individual property. The designation cited the house's architectural significance, its state of preservation, and its importance to understanding antebellum commerce and society in coastal Georgia. There was a small ceremony at the house, attended by representatives from the Preservation Division, the Historical Society, and a handful of state officials. A bronze plaque was mounted beside my front door, identifying the house as the Josiah Crawford House and noting its National Register status. Derek joked that I should send a photo of the plaque to Brenda. I didn't, but I understood the temptation. The plaque represented everything she tried to deny: official recognition that my property was special, exempt, protected by forces much larger than any HOA. Summer settled over Savannah with its usual heat and humidity. I spent evenings on my porch, which wrapped around 3 sides of the house, reading and grading papers and watching neighbors walk by. Many of them waved or stopped to chat. The neighborhood felt different now, less anxious, more relaxed. The reformed HOA rules had lifted a cloud of petty enforcement that I hadn't fully appreciated until it was gone. In August, Susan Martinez called with surprising news. "Peter, I wanted you to know that your case has had ripple effects beyond Meadowbrook Estates. We've been contacted by 3 other attorneys handling similar situations in Georgia. They're using your case as precedent. 2 HOAs have already settled disputes with historic property owners rather than face lawsuits." "That's good news," I said. "There's more. The Georgia legislature is considering a bill that would clarify the rights of historic property owners in HOA communities. It would require HOAs to formally acknowledge historic designations and establish special review processes for properties with preservation protections. Several legislators cited your case as inspiration." I sat down, stunned. "I just wanted to keep my wreath." Susan laughed. "I know. But sometimes individual acts of resistance create broader change. You were willing to fight, to do the research, to stand up publicly. That inspired others. It showed what's possible." The legislative session was months away, but Susan kept me updated on the bill's progress. It was championed by a representative from Athens who owned a historic property and had faced his own HOA conflicts. The bill wasn't just about historic properties, though. It included broader reforms to HOA governance, transparency requirements, and enhanced protections for homeowners. As fall approached, I reflected on the journey from that December morning when Brenda had confronted me about the wreath. 2 years had passed. My house had been formally recognized as historically significant. The HOA had been reformed. Legal precedent had been established. Legislation was pending that might protect thousands of other homeowners. And through it all, my grandmother's wreath had hung on my door each December, exactly where it belonged. The legislative bill passed in March of the following year, signed into law by the governor at a ceremony I attended. The final version included provisions specifically protecting historic properties from overly restrictive HOA rules, requiring HOAs to accommodate traditional decorations and landscaping consistent with historic character, and establishing penalties for HOAs that knowingly exceeded their authority. The governor mentioned my case in his signing remarks, calling it an example of an informed citizen using the system to create positive change. I shook his hand and thanked him, feeling oddly disconnected from the whole thing. In my mind, I was still just a history teacher who'd wanted to honor his grandmother's memory. But maybe that was the point. Big changes often start with small personal acts. Someone deciding that this rule doesn't make sense, this authority isn't legitimate, this fight is worth having. You don't set out to change laws. You set out to do what's right, and sometimes, if you're persistent and lucky, change follows. I returned home to my 1847 house with its heart pine floors and its wavy glass windows and its history soaked into every board and beam. The azaleas were blooming, planted by some long-dead gardener who'd wanted beauty to outlast them. Spanish moss draped from the live oaks, the same trees that had shaded Josiah Crawford when he'd walked this ground almost 2 centuries ago. My phone rang. It was Tom. "Hey, I just got an interesting call. A documentary filmmaker wants to do a short film about your case for a series on property rights and historic preservation. Interested?" I looked at my house, thinking about all the stories it contained. The merchant who'd built it, the families who'd lived in it, the wars and storms and changes it had witnessed. Now my story was part of that history, another layer in the ongoing narrative of this place. "Sure," I said, "if it helps people understand why these things matter." The documentary was filmed that summer, a crew spending several days at my house and interviewing me, Tom, Susan, Robert Chen, and several neighbors. They visited the county archives and filmed Dorothy helping them navigate the same records that had helped me. They interviewed the Preservation Division staff and the Historical Society. The resulting film was only 20 minutes long, but it was good. It wove together my personal story with broader themes about community, history, and the balance between collective governance and individual rights. It premiered at a film festival in Atlanta and was later picked up by Georgia Public Broadcasting. I watched it with friends in my living room, feeling strange seeing myself on screen talking about wreaths and HOA battles and historic preservation. But I was proud of what we'd accomplished. Not just the legal victory, but the conversation we'd started about what matters in our communities and our lives. Years passed. I continued teaching, continued living in my historic house, continued giving tours and sharing its story. The neighborhood thrived under its reformed governance. Robert Chen remained HOA president, running unopposed because people genuinely appreciated his fair, reasonable approach. Brenda moved away, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine. She'd sold her house and relocated to Florida. I felt no satisfaction in that news, just a vague sadness that she'd invested so much of herself in petty authority that she couldn't stay once that authority was stripped away. Each December, I hung my grandmother's wreath. Each spring, I participated in the historic home tours. Each year brought new students to my history classes, and I always shared the story of my house and my HOA battle as an example of how understanding history, knowing your rights, and being willing to stand up for principles can make a real difference. One of my students, a bright girl named Emma, wrote her senior research paper on HOA governance reform in Georgia. She interviewed me extensively, dug through legislative records, and produced a thoughtful analysis of how my case had influenced broader policy changes. Her paper won a state competition and earned her a scholarship to study public policy at the University of Georgia. "You inspired me," she told me when she came back to thank me after graduation. "You showed me that regular people can change systems that seem immovable." That's what I want to do with my life. I thought about that conversation a lot in the years that followed. We never know the full impact of our actions. I'd hung a wreath to honor my grandmother, and somehow that simple act had cascaded into legal reform, inspired students, and changed my neighborhood. The house continued to teach me. I discovered more of its history, found more artifacts, learned more stories. Each discovery deepened my connection to the property and my sense of responsibility as its steward. I wasn't just a homeowner. I was a temporary custodian of something larger than myself, a link in a long chain stretching from 1847 into an unknown future. My hair grayed. My students got older, or I got older, depending on perspective. The house remained solid and beautiful, requiring maintenance and care but fundamentally unchanged. The heart pine floors still glowed in afternoon sunlight. The original doors still swung on their hand-forged hinges. The rooms still held their history. And each December, my grandmother's wreath hung on the front door, evergreen and holly and tradition, representing family and memory and the importance of knowing what matters. Visitors to the house always asked about it, and I always told the story. Not to glorify my battle with the HOA, but to illustrate a simple truth that some things transcend rules, that history matters, that standing up for what's right is always worth the effort. The wreath was never just a decoration. It was a connection to the past, a symbol of resistance, a catalyst for change, and a reminder that our choices, even small ones, ripple outward in ways we can't predict. My grandmother made it to beautify her home for Christmas. I hung it to honor her memory. Together, we changed laws, reformed governance, and protected a piece of history for future generations. That's the power of understanding where we come from, respecting what came before, and refusing to let arbitrary authority erase the meaningful connections that make us human. My house taught me that. My grandmother taught me that. And in hanging that wreath, I pass those lessons forward to anyone willing to listen.